Hello and welcome. So, what if I told you that one single book tried to solve a problem that had stumped the world's greatest thinkers for centuries? We're diving into John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism, and it's not just some old, dusty philosophical text. No, this was a radical, incredibly elegant, and, pretty controversial attempt to give us one simple, powerful answer to the biggest question of all: what actually makes an action right or wrong?
To really appreciate just how much of a game-changer Mill's work was, we first have to get a feel for the world he was writing in. You see, for literally thousands of years, moral philosophy had been kind of running in circles.
Mill basically kicks off his book by pointing this out. He says, look, for 2,000 years, all the way from ancient Greece up to my time, the smartest people on the planet have been arguing about the very foundation of morality, and they've gotten almost nowhere. They just couldn't agree on a starting point, a first principle, to tell us what good even means.
I mean, the philosophical landscape was a total mess. You had some folks saying, we just feel what's right, through our intuition. Then you had others saying it all comes from divine commands. And then you had another group with all these complicated abstract rules. But here's the problem. None of them could actually be proven, and they were constantly contradicting each other. There was no common ground, no ultimate test to figure out who was right.
So, into this chaotic philosophical free-for-all, Mill proposes something that is just shockingly simple and powerful. So what was his big answer to this ancient, tangled-up question?
He called it the greatest happiness principle. And the core idea is this: the moral value of any action is decided by one thing and one thing only: how much it contributes to overall happiness. The ultimate goal, the very bedrock of all morality, is to create the most pleasure and the least pain for the greatest number of people. Simple as that. And just so we're all on the same page, when Mill talks about happiness, he's being very direct. He means pleasure and not being in pain. It's a really straightforward, kind of common sense idea. But as you can probably guess, this simple definition immediately kicked up a huge storm of controversy.
Okay, so the first and maybe the most famous attack was that this was a philosophy that was crude, that it was degrading. Critics called it a pig's philosophy, something fit for an animal, not a human.
You can just imagine them, right? They jumped all over this, saying, wait a minute, you're telling us that the meaning of life, that morality, is all just about seeking pleasure? That's disgusting. That reduces all of humanity's noble goals to the level of a pig just happy to roll around in the mud.
But this is where Mill's response is just brilliant. He turns it right back on them. He says, actually, you're the ones with a low view of humanity if you think we're only capable of the same pleasures as an animal. He makes this absolutely crucial distinction, not just between the amount of pleasure, but its quality. Sure, he says, there are lower pleasures, physical ones, but there are also higher pleasures, the pleasure you get from intellect, from art, from your feelings, from being a moral person. And this is probably his most famous quote, and it just perfectly nails the argument. Mill's point is that any person who has actually experienced both kinds of pleasure, the higher and the lower, will always prefer the higher ones. He says a satisfied fool only knows their side of the story, but an unsatisfied Socrates, he knows both sides. And that, Mill argues, makes all the difference.
Okay, so he's dealt with the pig philosophy critique. But the next big attack was that utilitarianism is just a recipe for selfishness, right? If my goal is maximizing pleasure, why should I ever care about anybody else? Well, Mill has a very clear answer for this, too.
And he is absolutely emphatic here. The moral standard is not about maximizing your own personal happiness. That's not utilitarianism. That's just plain old egoism.
No, the real standard is about creating the greatest amount of happiness in total, for everyone who is affected by what you do. The focus completely shifts from the individual to the good of the entire group.
And this quote just perfectly captures how demanding this idea really is. Mill says we have to act like a neutral, kind observer. We have to, in a sense, step outside of ourselves and weigh our own happiness as being worth exactly the same as anyone else's. No more, no less. It's an incredibly high and deeply altruistic standard.
Now, this wasn't just some abstract idea meant to be debated in university halls. The real power of utilitarianism, and why we're still talking about it, is how this big principle translates from theory into the real world. So why does this 19th century idea still have such a massive impact today?
Well, at its core, utilitarianism gives us a practical tool, a sort of moral calculus for making tough calls. It's a three-step process. First, you figure out your options. Second, you try to calculate the consequences, all the happiness and unhappiness for everyone involved. And third, you pick the option that creates the best overall outcome. It tries to turn morality from a big mystery into a problem you can actually solve.
And once you start looking for this way of thinking, you realize it is everywhere. It's the hidden logic behind cost-benefit analysis in government and economics. It's what guides a doctor in an emergency room doing triage, trying to save the most lives possible. It's the engine driving movements like effective altruism. It's even the foundation for animal rights laws, because if an animal can suffer, then its suffering has to be part of the moral equation.
And at the end of the day, that's Mill's greatest legacy. In a world full of conflicting feelings and beliefs about right and wrong, he gave us a clear, rational, and understandable method for trying to work through those disagreements. It doesn't promise the answers will be easy, in fact, they're often incredibly hard, but it gives us a shared goal, trying to make the world a happier place for everyone.
But, and this is a huge but, it also leaves us with some incredibly difficult, even haunting questions. Because this same logic can lead to some very uncomfortable places, forcing us to ask this exact question. It's a dilemma we still wrestle with every single day in our hospitals, our courtrooms, and in our own lives. And it shows us that Mill's great project is one we're still very much a part of.
This is for entertainment and educational purposes only.